I think employees too need to be well equipped to understand what does flexible work arrangements mean. I think a lot of people out there still think of it as being work from home, but really it's not. Correct. So it's flexi time, flexi load, and flexi place.
Welcome back to another episode of Wise and Shine. I'm Dawn, Budget Babe, and today we're going to be talking about a really hot topic, which is about flexible work arrangement. Is it really a win-win for employees and businesses, or is it just something very fluffy in theory that's going to be very hard to execute on the ground? To help us address this topic, we have my co-host Alex and our special guest.
Thank you, everyone. This is Alex Low. You can find me on social media, Alex Low, Growth Mindset Coach. Our special guest for today is a member of parliament. Of course, on top of that, she wears many different hats. And I'll leave it to Miss Yeo to introduce herself. Miss Yeo, please.
Thank you so much, Dawn, Alex. Hi everybody. My name is Yeo Wan Ling. As Alex mentioned, I'm actually with the NTUC, but beyond that too, I'm also the MP for Pasir Ris Punggol and many other things I think that we will talk about. But actually, that's the reason why we need to look at flexible work arrangements, because there are many different types of jobs out there that would demand many different types of attention put into the jobs. And therefore, I think flexible work arrangements are a great way to be able to sustain our interests, but also at the same time to take care of some of our responsibilities at home.
Yes, as a caregiver myself, I really welcome the change. I think the questions really is on how it's going to be enacted. But we're going to ask you, because as you are the co-chair of the Tripartite group for this flexible work arrangement, you had a lot of say and you were deeply involved in pushing through with the policy, designing it, and you probably have already spoken on the ground, right? You've heard all the objections. So
objections as well as the yays for it.
And I bet the yays are from the workers, but the objections are from the businesses?
Yes and no. Perhaps maybe what I can do, right, is to share with all of you our thinking behind setting up the Tripartite Work Group for Flexible Work Arrangements requests. Yes. There's an R behind it, okay? So it's FWAR. FWAR, FWAR. Okay, so what happens, right, is that flexible work arrangements has been something that the unions, the labor movement, we've been fighting for decades. In fact, right, I would say, I remember one of the earliest calls for this, right, was by our then President Halima when she was with NTUC. And we believe, right, that this is actually a great way to help retain women in the workforce or attract women back to the workforce. And it's really because we think that a lot of women out there are actually the main caregivers in their own families. And so what happens was, I would say I was kind of lucky, because prior to me joining the NTUC, I actually had a company that was actually in caregiving. And we had about 12,000 women who were with us. They were freelancers. And I think, the reason why many people are freelancers is because they want flexible time and flexible place when it comes to work. And it was because of these women that, it gave me that whole entire foundation of understanding what women or what people, right, who are in caregiving roles are looking for. And so what happens was when we formulated the policy, and by the way, the policy, right, is not something that came out new. In fact, right, before the Tripartite Guidelines for Flexible Work Arrangements, we actually had Tripartite Standards for Flexible Work Arrangements. And the Tripartite Standards at that time was actually on the promotion of getting people to adopt at least one type of flexible work. And there are many types. So a lot of people think that it is work from home, but it's not, okay? So actually, there are three types of flexible work arrangements. The first one is actually flexible time. The second one is flexible place. And the last one is actually flexible load. So let me talk a little bit about all these three. So flexible timing, right, comes like, for instance, you might want to start work a little bit later. And this works really well for women who are in their 40s or women, right, with school-going kids. A lot of them, right, actually want to tie up the time where they drop off their children, to school. Or maybe, right, some of the seniors that they're looking after at the senior activity centers. And after that, right, they come into work. So by the time they come in, maybe it's about 10 o'clock, 10:30. And, and this is when, right, they would be wanting to look for more flexible timing when it comes to, arranging for FWAs. And of course, right, when we're talking about flexible place, work from home is one. But do you know there are many clever companies now? You know what they do? Including the MOM. They actually, right, have satellite offices that are nearer places where people live. And so it cuts down your traveling time. So like, I look after Punggol, and I really wish, right, that, we have more of these like, satellite offices there. But I think we're going to have some because we have that Punggol Digital District coming up soon. So that's kind of cool. It's kind of cool to wake up like maybe about 8:40, brush your teeth, take the LRT and get there right by 9. And of course, the last one, which maybe people don't really understand as much, is actually flexible load. And actually, right, that comes, right, with part-timing. So like, for instance, right, can a job role be split into 2 or 3? And so one of the things that we found out, scientific surveys, by the way, that actually a golden number of hours for caregivers is about 4 hours.
Per day.
4 hours per day. And so actually, right, it might work out very well, if employers look at having their job roles cut into different parts, like let's say, for 3 people or 2 people to manage. So I think, these are many, many different ways in which we can be looking at flexible work arrangements. And I think, right, that also at the same time, when we did our surveys, who are in their 40s prefer flexible time, and people who are younger actually like flexible place.
I can definitely relate to that. I mean, I'm a mom of 2 young kids. My kids are still in preschool. So for me, when the pandemic hit, one of the best things that came out of it was the fact that companies now allow their employees to work from home. I think prior to that, a lot of us struggled because we felt like we were just weekend parents.
But Dawn, do you remember? It seems that the whole lockdown was like a lifetime away.
Eons ago, right?
I still remember that one of the things that many parents were crying foul about was, get us out of home. We don't want to be at home. We want to go back to the workplace and all that. And that is the reason why I think it was wonderful that from our Tripartite standards, which is about flexible work arrangements, we evolved this to Tripartite Guidelines for Flexible Work Arrangements Requests. Because one of the things I realized is that for every person, their caregiving journey or the reasons why they're going on flexible work is a little bit different. And, as opposed, right, to having a one-size-fit-all, which is flexible work, that means, everybody, right, just needs to come to work, right, 4 times in a week, and then the one time, right, you stay at home, one day you stay at home. It might not work for everyone. And therefore, right, it was good that this thing was expanded in a way to accommodate the individual reasons or individual challenges that people have. And therefore, right, it is personalized to a level where it is at a request from one person, from one employee to the organization.
One of the questions I want to ask is, today we see a lot of in the media, right, that large companies are asking the entire workforce to come back to the office to work. And I don't know whether it's fortunate or unfortunate, but we are launching this FWA in December. So how does that sit, right, with NTUC or with
you're so nice. You never name the company. Can't I call out? So in the news media, there's Amazon, Microsoft, Grab. I mean, there's a lot of names. And yeah, it's quite ironic, right? Like, as you guys are about to launch, and then all these big names are saying, come back or you won't have a job waiting for you. What's your view on that?
Actually, I'm very happy that they're doing this because I'm very sure, right, they're going to have losses of talent, and for all the rest of the other companies out there, right, who are embracing flexible work arrangements, they'll be very, very grateful and happy recipients of great talent.
I like that mindset.
Yeah.
There was a conspiracy theory you're telling me about, right?
So the conspiracy theory is they are calling everyone back because they know that probably 20-30% will send in their resignation letter, and I'd rather work for a company that has that FWA.
And actually, Alex, I think, right, that companies are all about adaptability. And it could be a situation where they're calling back their employees because they might want to do a change culture. And sometimes, right, it is important to have employees back in the same place, at least for a while you build up trust. So it could be a situation, right, where, over the years and all that, right, what happens was, the center for control or the center for trust was eroded away. So I'm not in those companies. So I don't really know the rationale behind why they're insisting or asking for that, but I would say that the workers have spoken. We had a Every Worker Matters conversation that ended after 18 months, engagement with 40,000 workers. And it was surprising, but not surprising, but, actually the number one topic right top of the mind, right, was actually caregiving. And I think, right, if you're operating in the Singapore situation, you can't really run away from the fact that, people do need, to look after their young and I actually think increasingly really the seniors. We are a super aging, society. And how do businesses and companies, right, wrap themselves around this? Yeah, so I do think, right, that is an important consideration for many, many companies. But like I said, if I look at it from a more positive point of view, it could be, you call back your forces first because, right, you kind of want to make sure that trust is being built, communications are properly done before you go the next mile. So I would expect like maybe some pendulum swing that's happening.
And one of these guidelines is for employers to now fairly consider these requests as opposed to previously where it was more voluntary. Could you talk about that shift and has it been successful?
Well, I'm going to talk about two shifts, okay? So the first shift, right, is really about how employers need to properly consider an employee's request for flexible work arrangements. I think, right, this is important because I would say that well, the vast majority of companies actually, right, are very welcoming of flexible work arrangements. There are some recalcitrant employees. These could be employees who say, I just don't believe in flexible work arrangements. Everybody just needs to come to work, right? 5 times, like Monday to Friday, and you must arrive, right, at 9 a.m. Cannot 9:01, 9 a.m. and that's it. And then you go back, right, at 6. You've got 1 minute, like earlier, right, then 6, right, then too bad. I'm going to, minus your money and all that. But what happens, right, I would say that the reason why we have this portion that allows for formalized request is really, right, to set the pathway for people, for employees who are in such companies to be able, right, to speak their minds. But I would say for the vast majority of companies out there, and by the way, we're looking at 70% of all Singapore companies now having one form of flexible work arrangements. The vast majority, I don't think you need to go into this formalized process. In fact, I would say, right, most companies, if you really have a process that's already working well for you, like for instance, right, sometimes all you need to do is to text your boss. My mother-in-law, right, recently had kidney failure, and we need to go for kidney dialysis 3 times a week. Is it okay, if I come and report to work a bit later, on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays? And if your boss is okay, with this texting, or maybe an email, then you're okay. So actually, right, if you do need to go into a formalized way of downloading templates, and like putting this through a formal process, actually it means, right, that communication or trust has somewhat broken in the company itself. And we hope, right, that by talking about flexible work arrangements and the request for it, it also allows for this, discussion, this conversation to happen, right, within our Singapore context, our Singapore community, so that people will realize that it's actually important for us to be embracing flexible work, not just only for caregivers. And by the way, your taukaes, right, are also caregivers. So most taukaes I know are very, very empathetic about it. But also at the same time, how do you frame? We talked about how companies need to properly consider, but also at the same time, it is important for employees, for workers to know how to fairly ask for it as well.
But in reality, some rogue employers may say that they have fairly considered it and still reject. So what is NTUC's view on this and what support can such whistleblowers get?
Actually, the other way that I wanted to say is that when we were setting up this whole flexible work arrangements portion, we actually did studies in some other countries where the rollout of flexible work arrangements as legislation was already for a few years. And one of the things that we realized for the most successful companies out there, the mindset shift was actually even a little bit further than considering whether or not flexible work arrangements could work. Actually, right, the mindset shift is actually in the arena where it's, yes, flex. So an employee can say, hey, boss, I need to take Wednesdays off now. Okay, sure. Let's make it happen. Versus, okay, let me think about this and we'll consider. So I hope, right, that Singapore as a society would be able to evolve to that level. And so this brings us into, the second part. So we have some recalcitrant workplaces or bosses, right, who don't really agree. Well, I would say, right, there are a couple of levels that we can be looking at it. So if, let's say, the company is a unionized company or a company, right, that's part of the labor movement, so they could have signed an MOU, with the NTUC or, they were probably, signatories to the tripartite standards and all that. What happens is that more likely you would actually have a branch official. And the branch official is somebody who's actually trained in the union's ways within your organization. And this is when the branch official, typically before you need to go out, right, to talk to your HR or to your bosses and all that, the branch officials would come and have a chat with the employee to see what went wrong in that request. So I would say that there could be some vexatious or, really strange reasons why people might want to go flexible work arrangements. And examples I've heard, for instance, stem out of jealousy.
Okay.
Between employees.
Exactly. So like, let's say you have Auntie Abby, and she takes Mondays off because she maybe has to look after her special needs child. And then Auntie Betty, comes and say, Mondays off? I also want to have Mondays off. And therefore, right, I'm going to ask my organization, whether I can have Mondays off just because, Auntie A had it. So I think, right, that is not a very fair way of asking for flexible work arrangements. It typically needs to come with, a good reason why you want to do it. And that's when I think, right, a lot of the branch officials or, some of the industrial relations officers, who are part of the NTUC, they would be a wonderful resource for both the companies as well as the workers to work it through on how do you ask for flexible work arrangements in a fair way, in a win-win way for both the company as well as for the worker.
So coming from a caregiver's point of view, because I think that stems from how this was all started, would there then be priority for a specific employee with a caregiving need versus somebody with no caregiving need? How do you prioritize as an employer these requests?
So that's why, right, I think, right, having an open trust culture is important within organizations. And therefore, right, I had mentioned about how in some of the other jurisdictions that we went to, Australia, New Zealand and all that, and the culture is actually yes, flex. Okay, let's make this work. And this yes, let's make this work isn't just about at the employer's level. It's also, right, amongst the colleagues, And so what happens, I would believe, right, for a good progressive company with a good trust culture that's built in, an open conversation would happen within the management of a company, between the workers and among all the parties involved. And I'm very sure Singaporeans being very reasonable would also, right, we would be able to work out how we want to look at this from various angles. Now, there is also, I would say, a recommendation that was inside the Tripartite Guidelines. And it was actually about how such requests, it's not forever. So there's actually an expiry behind it. And I think, right, our best practice was 3 months.
Only 3 months?
No, it's a best practice. Okay. Yeah, so of course, right, you can say that I need to, maybe go on flexible work for the next 1 year, for instance, and that's fine. But what happens, right, is that, we do recommend that maybe there's a 3 months consideration because maybe really Auntie B later on, right, really had a very valid reason why she had to go on flexible work. And just because, right, Auntie A asked for Mondays off, it doesn't mean, right, that Auntie B cannot get Monday off. And so, right, there is that period of deciding on, what works out well. And I really think, right, it all has to do with proper communications, trust that's built, within the organization as well. Now, if all else breaks, we actually have TAFEP, okay? So TAFEP, right, is actually part of the MOM. And what happens at TAFEP, right, is that you can actually, as an employee, you can actually bring up your grievance on how you feel that maybe the company didn't properly assess, right, your requests. And that's when TAFEP, right, will actually educate the company, on what constitutes proper evaluation of a flexible work arrangement request.
Understand.
I'm hearing that.
I have 2 questions, sorry. The first one is the building of that culture of trust is a difficult thing to do, right? Because I think as Singaporeans, Asian mentality always paiseh to say this, paiseh to say that. So unless that a precedent has been set or formal training has been put in place, then otherwise I think it's practically impossible to go for that shift, right? So that's the first question.
Okay, wait, before you go to the second, I'll forget what your second one. Because, right, so now I work for the NTUC, but I also run a unit. And I would say, right, for the last 10 interviews I had, out of 10, right, 9 candidates, right, asked me, you got flexible work arrangements or not? So I think not paiseh. Yeah, I don't think it's very paiseh. But what happens too, right, is that I understand that there might be, certain pockets of our workers who might feel a little bit shy or don't really know how to go about doing this. And therefore, right, it is important that there is templates. Actually, it's very simple one. The templates is your name. How long, right, do you need to go for flexible work arrangements for? Whether it's, work from home, whether or not, right, it is taking part-time work and all that. And the reason for it. So it's actually a very simple thing. And actually, if you do have your branch official or the IRO there, actually, we're here to help coach you, to help you understand how do you ask this properly. And of course, right, there's also the NTUC Women and Family Unit where I run that unit. And I think, right, that's also, we have well-trained unionists, right, who would actually guide a person, right, to be open and to ask about this.
Okay. Second question is Auntie A, Auntie B, having an issue. Then there's also Auntie C and Auntie D, and it could potentially create a lot more work for the employer managing all of these FWAR. So is there a workaround based on research and studies? Yeah.
Actually, right, I have a very interesting case to share with you. And it's not just only about like two pairs of people. Actually, that's an organization that you probably would never ever believe that they are fully embraced with flexible work arrangements. And they have 70 different types of flexible work arrangements. This was an industry that was very important to us during COVID and even now.
Healthcare.
Yes, nurses. Tan Tock Seng. So Tan Tock Seng, right, thought that it was important for them, to embrace flexible work arrangements because, right, the majority of their workers, their nurses are females. And, it was also important for the company to do this or the hospital to do this because they want to ensure that they retain talent. And so they actually came out, right, with flexible work arrangements, a permutation of 70 different types. Yeah, and it is exactly what you talked about because these would be, there could be tensions and all that kind of stuff. And so what happens was they actually invested in technology. They invested actually in a scheduling system that allows people, right, to ask for flexible work arrangements or to book for flexible work arrangements, right, in a fair way. And I would say they did this together, right, with support from the larger NTUC. We actually have something called the Company Training Committee grant. And this, right, is a grant that helps companies look at how they redesign their work processes. And some companies use this, right, to implement flexible work arrangements.
And this is something that SMEs can also tap on, right? So everyone
so long as you're part of the labor movement, so long as you're a unionized company, so long as you sign an MOU with us, and so long as you pledge yourself, right, to, really looking out for workers' rights, you can actually be part of, the CTC and you can actually enjoy, right, the CTC grants.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying Wise and Shine so far. I'm your host Reggie, aka your chief financial coconut, and for us to continue to do this show so that you become a tad bit wiser every week, you gotta like, share, subscribe, help us beat the algorithm, but even more importantly, if you can, comment in the comment section below, let us know your thoughts and also some questions that you would love us to answer. Yep, now back to the show.
Right. I'm hearing a lot about the word fair, but sometimes what's fair to one person might not be fair to another. So there was this recent viral CNOA reaction video where the younger generation, those who were either single or married with no kids, were complaining about having to take on extra workload for when the folks who are caregivers in the organization goes on this kind of flexible leave or work arrangements. What is NTUC's view on that? Because to someone who's not a caregiver, they might say, well, it's fair for me too, right? I'm Auntie Betty, and just because Auntie Abby has a mother who she needs to take care of, I also have my own mental health, mental wellness, and I want time off.
Actually, right, you touch on something that is actually very important to me. It actually has to do with the sustainability of flexible work arrangements. When the union started fighting, right, for flexible work arrangements, right, to be normalized in workplaces like decades ago, we really had quite a lot of pushbacks. People say, oh, 不可能啦, cannot be, that kind of stuff, our productivity will whatever. But we still continued the good fight. Then something happened. It was called COVID. Okay, and in the act of bobianism, what happens, right, was that companies had to roll out flexible work arrangements. And you know what? At the height of COVID, right, 90% of companies in Singapore actually had flexible work arrangements. But post-COVID, this thing dropped to 70%. So there was a 20% dip. And I think, right, it actually has to do with how a lot of companies, right, went into this as a knee-jerk reaction, right? And there wasn't any proper planning or processes that was put around it. And I would say that, well, we are now embracing, right, how we can introduce more flexible work arrangements into the organization. It's actually important for us to look at the second part, which is keeping it sustainable and fair. And therefore, it's something that people don't really talk about, is actually having to rehaul or maybe even having, right, to improve on your performance appraisals systems. Now, in ancient times, right, even now, okay, I still remember once a year, I felt very, very scared, right, towards now, around this period, my boss will haul me up, right, for a 1 hour PA on how I'm doing, that kind of stuff, right? And actually right now, I'm just thinking, why does it need to be once a year? And by the time you talk to me, right, at the end of the year, right, it's a bit late already if I'm not performing to your expectations, right? And so I would say it is important that we look at performance appraisals, right, in a way that is outcomes based. So it doesn't matter whether or not, right, you are working from home or whether or not you're in the office the whole time, right, with your boss, then you're having lunch with your boss and all that. So long, right, as parameters are being set, that you know what your KPIs are, you know what the organization, right, requires of you. I think, right, this would come very fair when it comes to, rewarding a person, right, at the end of the year. Whether or not you have covered someone, right, when the person went on maternity and all that. And the other one too, right, is seriously, maybe bosses, right, can do regular check-ins. So I've seen some really progressive companies. The check-ins is every day, but it's 5 minutes only. They have a stand-down meeting at the end of the day, or in the morning, right, they have a stand-up meeting. Or for me, what I try to do, right, if my direct reports, I try to see them once a week. And then for the non-direct ones, right, like maybe 1 or 2 levels down, I try to meet them like, once a month or once every 2 months. Yeah, so this is, I think, a great way for us to check in, on what's needed. Make sure, right, the employee is, feeling not the heat and all that. And mental wellness is definitely a big issue, and what is it, right, that the company can do, in the face of this to help? So could it be about having more, timeouts? Could it be having like, I saw something quite cool, like on Fridays, right, everybody go back, half an hour earlier, spend time with your kids or spend time with your seniors, or just read a book. Yeah, so I think there are many ways, in which we can be looking at this, but at the heart of it is really about, after you introduce flexible work arrangements, companies actually, right, do have the responsibility to ensure, right, that flexible work arrangements are carried out in a fair way and that employees feel that they are fairly treated when it comes to appraisals at the end of it all.
Now, these guidelines were announced first in April, but the rollout is actually in December. Can you explain the rationale behind having such a long rollout?
I think this rollout is important for 2 reasons. The reason why I can talk about this, right, like this, blah, 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 is because I think I've done over 100 engagement sessions. And this was done prior to us introducing the Tripartite Guidelines and after. And, we met up with worker groups. We met up with female groups. We even met up, right, with female lawyers. We met up, right, with employers, SMEs, MNCs, HR, tauges and all that. And it was actually for us to prep the ground to be ready for this. But the other thing too, right, is that I think this rollout period is important, especially for some companies. Oh, by the way, right, I've not really met any bad employers who say they don't believe in flexible work arrangements. Because like I mentioned just now, right, for me, right, the last 10 interviews I had, 9 of them, first 5 minutes, right, you got flexible work arrangements already. Employers know that if they do not embrace flexible work arrangements in one way or another within the organization, they will lose out to the other company that actually has it. And in fact, right, the NTUC is the Women and Family Unit. We're going to be launching with our sister company E2I, a Yes Flex job portal, advertising jobs that are flexible. But back to what I was saying. Well, I've never met a bad tauke who didn't agree, but there were actually, right, companies who actually kind of need to be ready for this. Now, remember, I talked about trust culture. And as part of the trust culture, I think it's also important that the companies look at, for instance, what I mentioned just now, look at their performance appraisal systems. But many companies actually don't even have an employee handbook. I think that employee handbook is important because, right, it will state out upfront, and being honest and trustworthy means, right, you talk about, your constraints, your challenges, as well as your aspirations upfront, even on the company side. And it's talking about, like, for instance, oh yeah, the company, right, actually needs a lot of frontliners, for instance, and therefore, right, we need, people, right, to be out at the reception, at all times when we're open, for instance, something like this. Or it talks about, your policies regarding flexible work arrangements. So with this, it does allow, right, for in future when people are having that discourse about whether my request, can be approved or not, whether or not it meets or it damages, right, the company in terms of what it needs to do when it comes to, your business priorities and all that. At least, right, that handbook is something that you can refer to. And for the tauges out there or the budding tauges out there who are thinking about, hey, how do I get this employee's handbook? Actually, there are many, many free resources that's coming out. NTUC, of course, has it. But beyond that as well, right, a lot of the partners, people who were actually on the tripartite work group like IHRP, all of us have all these templates for you to download and for you to adapt from it. So, I think it's good that companies start to prepare themselves for this, and for HR professionals out there too, to have a think about how, you might want to revamp your performance appraisal systems And also at the same time, how do you promote trust, right, within your company's culture?
I mean, at the end of the day, what I'm hearing is the onus is on the employer, more so for the employer during this period of time because we are preparing for launch in December, right?
That's right. I think employees too need to be well equipped to understand what does flexible work arrangements mean. I think a lot of people out there still think of it as being work from home, but really it's not.
Yeah, I love how you frame it in the 3 different parts. I never thought of it that way.
Correct. So it's flexi time, flexi load, and flexi place.
The flexi load, I think, is not new for all ministries. So I used to be MOE, so having
你是
half
老师啊
load
，you
我以前是老师，对。
可以看到有那个
你可以猜一下什么老师？
皮衣啊。
对了。
For those of you who don't know, Alex used to play sports, national rep.
Oh, I see. What sports?
Water polo.
Oh, I see. Oh, quite hot.
So, I mean, it's not new, right? Flexi load, but the flexi time, of course, depending on which is the industry that you're in, I think now everyone is a lot more open to the 3 options available.
Yes. And I think people just need to know that there's this 3, and really, I think the most important bit about this is that the request portion of it personalizes the flexible work arrangements for workers. Because really, I've never seen, right, a caregiver or a person asking for flexible work, right, having the same life journey as another person. And therefore, right, I would say that this wins a lot of other pre-existing type of arrangements, like, well, everybody just, comes to work Monday to Friday and Monday to Thursday, and then Friday you can take one day off, and work from home. It doesn't work for everyone.
So would you say that this then supersedes that kind of a policy, or how? It's really up to the organization.
It's up to the organization. Like I said, organizations does have its business priorities. And I would say that some organizations would have cadence, like what I mentioned, but also at the same time, on top of that, right, which they need to allow with the Tripartite Guideline, for people, right, to properly to consider people's requests for work arrangements.
Do you happen to have statistics or data? You talk about a lot of women, right, caregiving, but what about the men? I know you're also championing for family, but what percentage of men out there are actually also needing to care for their families? I think it's good to know. Yeah,
They're
exactly.
the ones making this request, is it?
Because I'm the only guy on this show. Right?
Usually this is the time, right, where I come in to slime the guys a little bit. Actually, right, I would say that guys, right, the audience, right, I've done a lot of all these meetups and all that, engagements and all that. And usually, right, there will be guys out there who say that I'm also a caregiver. And I highly respect all caregivers, whether or not you're male and female. And this flexible work arrangement thing, right, is for all caregivers. It's not just for women. It's just that women right now, in the Singapore society, bears the brunt of most caregiving. And therefore we think, right, that this is going to be very beneficial for female workers, especially in bringing them back to the workforce. There's actually 260,000 women of economic age now, so they're 25 to 60, who are not working. And the number one reason why they're not working is because they're caregiving. And the second one, Dawn, you won't believe the second reason. It is housework. Yes,
that's why we can have technology take over, a robot vacuum.
Or at least, right, the better half to come in to help lah. So, in our scientific surveys, right, I think that survey had about 2,000, 3,000 people, right, replying. On the housework part, this is the sliming part, right? What happens is, guys, yeah, you do it, but your housework, right, equals to changing the light bulb, versus girls having to do ironing. So, it's things that, yes, you help around the house, but it's not on a daily basis. And so I think things would also be great, if at home, there was better lah. I wouldn't say equal, because sometimes us females also got our mumzilla periods where we don't touch my child, even though that's a dad, right? Yeah, so I think there needs to be, a better distribution.
We need a guidebook as well. Like males do daily tasks like wash the clothes.
Hey, I do the laundry and I do the vacuuming and mopping in the house.
But do you do the ironing?
We don't need to iron. That's why every day wear t-shirt.
That's why I say do the laundry, right? Throw
No
into
iron.
the, washing machine is one thing lah, but actually having to dry it and all that is another thing,
That's why I hire a helper.
But is there a move though, right?
But you're so right. Because actually, right, to me, flexible work arrangements is sustainable way, but it needs to come with a whole entire ecosystem. So your support system comes also, right, from something that we've been asking for, actually, the labor movement, it's actually asking for caregiving leave. The reason why I say caregiving leave is because Singapore is growing older, right? And it's important not only for us, of course, our total fertility rate is important for us to have, better paternity, maternity coverage. But I think it's also important for us, right, to be able to have more time out to care for our seniors. But having said this, I don't think it's sustainable for us to ask companies, right, for ad nauseum, type of, caregiving leave forever. Then you must well don't work lah, right? The company needs people, right? So I think in order to complement this, you need the flexible work arrangements. But Dawn, you brought up a great point. Is after that, right? What else? What kind of other type of supporting structures are there to help, keep women in the workforce or caregivers in the workforce? So actually, NTUC was actually the first organization, believe it or not, many, many years ago, to actually have childcare, big-scale childcare centers. And I think that moved the needle, to help women come back to the workforce. And I think, right, it's important that we continue to look for such great resources, because this would also include, like, for instance, your senior activity centers and domestic helpers. And actually, the NTUC, we do have, right, a migrant domestic worker center as well. And it's actually to help strengthen, the relationship between employers of the migrant domestic worker relations.
Would there be anything that will move the needle, right? You talked about moving the needle to bring women back into the workforce. Anything to move the needle to bring more men to be more involved at home, which is what you were talking about earlier, yeah. And would be very, very good for society, Singapore society in general. So we'd love to hear from you on that.
I think it has to be about in the workforce, right, in the workplace, that there's a normalization of guys taking on caregiver roles. I think that's very important. In fact, right, just now you were talking a bit about people shy to ask for flexible work arrangements. I actually don't really see this, but I see guys being shy when asking, right, for their rightful paternity leave. So I think it's important, right, that in a workplace, organizations have frank conversations about this. And someone needs to be brave, to start the ball rolling within the organization itself.
That's where we need to have that psychological safety, right?
Hey, I got an idea for your question. We need a government figure, like maybe a male MP who's a house husband. Then it sets a trend.
We can ask Miss Yeo to recommend somebody.
I think quite difficult to be house husband.
House husband
Because they are
MP.
so busy, right?
No, but you see, if the women can juggle work and caregiving and go and become MPs, then we still don't have a male figure yet. Once you have that, that's the visualization that people would think of.
Actually, I would say, right, that a lot of my male colleagues are very well involved with their kids. Louis, everybody knows the story of his 3 kids. And in fact, right, we just came back from an overseas parliament trip and we were talking about him chasing after labubus for his kids. Yeah. But yes, so I would say that there are many, many good examples out there. And in fact, right, Center for Fathering, we've also been working with them quite a bit, right, to try to adjust and to normalize this idea, right, of males in caregiving roles.
Yeah, because this is the struggle I have with my husband. The moment you can say, hey, that MP do, hey, that minister do, hey, that CEO is the house husband, he do housework, then the husband's got no more rebuttal.
Yes, correct. Exactly.
More role models, right?
Yeah, we need more role
Local
models.
role models.
Yes, but I think it's also role modeling within the organization itself, And, you asked about how, I remember you said something about how trust is difficult to build. Actually, one of the ways, right, which I think has been very effective in organizations is that if that whole concept of embracing flexible work, normalizing it, is actually started off from right on top, CEO level. And then, you drive it downwards. I found that to be very, very effective. And in fact, right, in preparation for the launch of this, actually the NTUC, we did launch a white paper. And there were many examples inside there of companies who have used flexible work arrangements to very effective means. And the examples that I had in there, the people who were being interviewed and all that, were actually the CEOs. And the CEOs strongly believed in it. They were husbands, they were sons, and they understand. So I think, right, it is important for organizations, right, to have that whole, conversation, right on top. And in fact, in our discussions, right, engagements with, the industry and all that, actually a lot of the HR directors said that they're all for it. And whether or not, right, we could speak with their taukies, to see if the taukia is for it as well, or to understand, that part of the story.
Yeah, shout out to my boss, man. My CEO took his paternity leave and the male the new fathers in my company do not shy away from taking their paternity leave. I like to think it's because our CEO set the precedent himself.
Well done, Financial Coconuts. You're the best. CEO, NUT.
Anyway, I want to ask about recourse, right? At the end of the day, there will be some employees who will feel that they have fairly asked for it. And then the employer will also say, but I fairly considered and I fairly rejected it. So what are the recourse for the employee or the employer in these kind of scenarios?
So I talked about how, it's good to have that conversation, and if it cannot be resolved, that's tough for you. But you know what? At the end of it all, right, if it's not working out for you, there's always, right, another job out there. And another job, right, that will offer flexible work arrangements. Yeah, so like I mentioned, I know that companies are embracing this now because they know, right, that this is a very big point for them, right, to be attracting employees. Yeah, and so there will be organizations out there. And remember, we're launching our Yes Flex portal, and this is precisely, right, to advertise, right, for companies who are actually embracing flexible work arrangement culture.
But for an employee who doesn't want to change roles or change company, then what can they do in order to seek recourse?
So there's TAFEP, like I mentioned.
Okay, so go straight to TAFEP and raise it up. Okay.
Okay.
And in this age of layoff, some of our listeners have actually shared that in the beginning when the guidelines were rolled out, they were quite positive. They were looking forward to it. But then in the last few months alone, we've seen a lot of layoffs, a lot of retrenchments, to the point where some employees who want to take those FWAs or ask are now feeling like, oh, if I take it, then my job might be the next on the line versus another employee who's not going to make that request.
Now, I tell you, if let's say for whatever reason that an employee, right, feels that he was discriminated against, right, and he lost his job because he asked for flexible work arrangements, that's workplace discrimination. Yeah, we have a law that's coming out very soon. Legislation, by the way, and this will be something, right, that we'll be protecting.
So would the same recourse apply whereby they'll have to go to TAFEP and escalate it?
Yeah, so I mean TAFEP and all that, but I think, right, the important thing, again, right, is that the trust part is very important. Trust and productivity. I think these are the two main things, right, that makes flexible work arrangements sustainable. And the trust is not just, what the company is to you. As an employee too, you need to create that trust structure. I've seen really naughty workers go do TikToking in a mall when they were supposed to be working from home. And I think, right, it is important that if you do this, you actually not only break that trust culture between you and your boss, but you might break it, right, within the whole company structure. And so remember, flexible work arrangement requests, right, or flexible work arrangements is not a construct that is worker versus employer. It's actually, right, as a whole society, where does Singapore want to move to? And therefore, it is important that all of us do our part to build that trust culture. The productivity part, right, is also important because for companies, right, in order for this to be sustainable, companies need to have FWAs and be productive. And in best case scenarios, to be even more productive, and how are we able to do this? So, it is about discipline from the worker's point of view, but also at the same time, right, from the company's point of view, to set up clear KPIs as well. Things that work well for the whole organization. So I think that part is important, for us to really be able to roll flexible work arrangements out in a logical, in a sustainable, and in a fair way.
So I guess that's your answer to what is a win-win arrangement if Singapore goes down the road of FWA or FWAR. If you have any opinion to chime in on this topic, just drop us a comment on the video below and we'll see you guys on the next episode of Wise and Shine. Thank you, Miss Yeo, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Enjoy your FWAs.